This is Dan Schneider, and on this edition of the Dan Schneider video interview, I will have my second of 3 interviews on the nature of existence. This time I will be speaking with a philosopher named Tyron Goldschmidt, and we will start in just a moment. In this interview, I will be speaking with Tyron Goldschmidt, and he is a philosopher, and I had originally had my first interview was with a bishop named John Spong, an Episcopalian bishop, and my third and final interview in this series will be with a physicist named Adam Frank. But I wanted to get the 3 sort of pillars of the way I think people approach the world. So welcome, Tyron. And for those viewers and listeners to this show, if you could just give sort of a Reader's Digest or a capsule version of who you are, where you work, and things you may have studied, or what your basic interest in philosophical pursuits are.
Yes, I teach at Wake Forest University. My main areas of research are metaphysics, philosophy of religion, and some history of philosophy too. And I have various publications in those areas, including some journal articles, an edited volume, and much more forthcoming.
Okay. You obviously are British. How did you end up in North Carolina then?
I'm not so obviously British. I'm originally from South Africa.
Oh, okay.
I went to I started graduate school in Britain. And I've been in the US now for some time. My wife is American, so my accent is in fact a terrible mix. I hope that your listeners can understand anything I'm saying.
I'm sure they will.
But it's a bit of a mix between South African, English, British, and American pronunciation. I don't know if I sound much South African anymore to South Africans, British to people in Britain, or anything American to people in America. It's a bit of a mess.
Well, let's start the interview with the idea of metaphysics, because I know most people, when they hear a term like metaphysics versus just regular physics, they get to thinking, well, are we talking about ghosts? Are we talking about Bigfoot? Are we talking about psychics and mediums? So what exactly is metaphysics?
Well, we're not talking for the most part about ghosts or mediums or crystals, or anything so exotic. Metaphysics studies questions about fundamental questions about the way the world is, and our place in the world. For example, some metaphysical questions are about the nature of personal identity. What kind of stuff are we? Are we bodies? Do we have souls? Are we something else? Another question in metaphysics is about the extent of our agency. Do we have free will? What kind of thing is it? To begin with, there are various fundamental questions about the ingredients of reality. Is all of reality just physical stuff? Is there some non-physical stuff? How should we understand the place of the mind, the place of morality, and other such things within a physical order, if that's possible at all? These fundamental philosophical questions fall under the very broad heading of metaphysics.
Yeah, this is you before we started taping, you were wondering if you were qualified to speak on this, but this is exactly the kind of things I want to get to. And as we are taping here in the middle of the year 2015, just recently, when you talked about identity, I thought of just about a week ago, a woman who was one of the leaders of the NAACP here in the United States, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, turned out to be a white woman. And there was controversy about her race. And then just a few weeks earlier, a famous athlete named Bruce Jenner who had won a medal 40 years ago at the Olympics, came out as a or claims to be a transgendered woman. So when you talked about identity, I immediately thought of those two things: what is race, what is sexuality, sexuality versus gender. And so basically, we're talking, instead of hard things like, if you mix chemicals together, you're talking about the more subtle things in life.
Sure, the questions about race and gender are big philosophical questions dealt with in various areas of philosophy. There are various ethical questions about these topics, but the kinds of questions there about identity that metaphysicians worry about are quite different. Maybe they're not regarded as so popular hot topics.
Yeah.
The question about personal identity, in particular, is a question about what makes for the same person at different times. At one time, you have a subject on the scene at a certain age with certain characteristics. Another time, you have a subject on the scene at a different age with different characteristics. Maybe at the earlier time, the subject had long hair, a certain psychological profile. At the later time, the subject had short hair and a quite different psychological profile. There's a question of, in virtue of what could we have the same person persisting through these changes? And to give you a better idea of the question, perhaps I could identify some answers. Some people will say it's in terms of the continuity of body. These stages of the person are related by being parts of a temporal parts, perhaps, of the same body. There's some bodily or physical continuity between these subjects. Another answer would be in terms of psychology, that what's really crucial to identity across time, what makes for the same person on the scene despite various changes, is some continuity in psychology. They have something of the same memories or personality, psychological profile. And yet a third answer is in terms of the soul. It's not body or psychology that makes for the same person across these changes, across time, but it's there being the same soul on the scene. And each of these answers gives rise to various puzzles. The philosopher's job is to, I suppose, to get clear on the question and various answers, to discover what the puzzles are and to try to answer them, discover what might be the best theory here.
And that's particularly...
Most of these questions are a little different, and though they might intersect at some point, doubtless, with questions about race and gender, they are a little different from the popular hot topics about identity that you raised.
Yeah, it's especially relevant regarding artificial intelligence. Some years back, I had done a written interview with another philosopher named Mark Rowlands, who works down in Florida, and he had brought up a topic called the river of selves, that we're not a conglomeration of atoms or subatomic particles, because, every between 4.5 and 7 years, depending on the person, we are different. So
yes,
if we
one doesn't want to identify the subject with a particular collection of particles, because of course the subject remains on the scene, and the particles might disperse, and sometimes the particles might not.
Right.
The particles might remain on the scene, but the subject not. We could imagine maybe we could imagine you or I swapping bodies, so to speak. Well, the collection of particles don't change places, but in that case we do. Maybe the collection of particles continues to exist long after we are gone. It would be problematic to identify the subject with this particular collection of particles.
Right. Well, it's the conundrum about Jason and the Argonauts and the Argo, and they go on their decade-long trip, and through every port, parts of the Argo get destroyed, and they replace the bow, they replace the mast, they replace different things, so that at the end of 10 years, they've slowly but surely replaced every single piece, every nail on the Argo, and they get back into wherever it is, Thracia or whatever part of Greece, Sparta that they came from, and is the Argo really the Argo? Because it has been bit by bit actually replaced, although it looks exactly the same as when it left. And so the difference, of course, is though the Argo is not a sentient thing, you or I, presumably, if we're not philosophical zombies, are sentient, so we would have at least the thread of memory and experience that would keep us whole.
Well, I hope not to disappoint on the zombie on the zombie point. It is late at night here. But the question of what this common core, this common little nugget could be that persists over these changes in physical parts, changes in psychology, what it could be, if anything at all, is a tricky one.
Yeah. Let me just then.
And I should say, not a puzzle that's specific to, even though you think that maybe we have a special interest in this puzzle when it comes to people, to ourselves, consciousness, intelligence. Similar puzzles arise for other things that we think can persist across changes. There's similar puzzles about making sense of the persistence of any sort of medium, or not so medium-sized dry goods whatsoever.
Let me touch upon some other things and just ask a few little questions. I would presume that at some point you do study consciousness, the nature of consciousness. Is that correct?
There are metaphysical puzzles about the nature of consciousness, questions about what the nature of psychology and conscious states are. Particularly puzzling is for philosophers, people who work on the metaphysics of mind, or philosophy of mind, as it's known more generally, is the question of the relationship between consciousness, psychological states, more broadly beliefs, desires, thoughts, and especially felt states, the sensation you have when you put your hand in a fire, or the sensation you have when you see a field of red, you taste vanilla. That makes sense of how these things are or could be related to the physical stuff that makes up your body. Because on the one hand, it seems we're inclined to think that we are intimately connected to our body and our psychology. Our consciousness seems to be quite closely connected to goings on in the brain. Some people want to understand psychological goings on in consciousness, just as goings on in the brain, just as neuronal firings and chemicals moving about in the brain. But then on the other hand, it is hard to see how that could be. It's hard to see how we could get to borrow an expression from Colin again, how we could get the technicolor experience out of the mushy gray stuff that is our brain. They seem to be very, very different things. The idea that a thought could have any particular weight, that feeling could exist located in some particular place, have a certain size, shape, strikes us as odd at first. And there are other puzzles that generate this oddness, and yet other thoughts that suggest that we should reduce or identify these conscious goings on with goings on in the brain. So figuring out this tension.
Yeah, the idea of
conscious goings on brain states or not. If not, what are they, and how are they related to brain states? Is perhaps the puzzle in philosophy of mind.
Yeah, the idea of qualia. If when I say red, if we see a stop sign, is the red that I see really mauve to you or something? Let me just ask. I'm sure you're familiar with the books of Daniel Dennett and his idea of his book Consciousness Explained, his multiple drafts theory. What do you think personally of it, and do you think what is its level of acceptance, say right now, generally in the field, that sort of the mind is sort of an incidental, accidental creation rather than a homunculus? Because I never really bought the homunculus idea, because it's like, the turtles upon turtles. When you think about a universe, the homunculus would have to have a homunculus who'd have to have a homunculus. So do you think that consciousness is something that is just an emergent property that when you throw enough information into a process, that what we believe is an individual consciousness is really just the mush of the workings going on?
Well, as for the first question about Daniel Dennett, it's been a while since I've read his stuff on consciousness, but he's a superb philosopher. Far be it from me to to say anything very enlightening and critical about his work. I think it is very much respected among. Given the question was how is it viewed among contemporary philosophers? It is respected. I don't think that his particular brand of materialism is necessarily accepted by a majority of philosophers, but the brand of materialism or of anti-materialism, of dualism, is endorsed by a majority of philosophers working in philosophy of mind. There is, my impression is, quite a lot of division in philosophy of mind between those who think that the mind is eliminable or reducible to something material and those who think that it is not. And then the finer, more particular theories between these camps. One can find distinguished philosophers, more than able thinkers defending all these views. So in the end, one doesn't know what exactly one should hold, if one's entitled to hold any view very strongly on these matters at all. I certainly don't think, it doesn't seem to me, for what it's worth, that any argument for materialism, for the view that the mind is identical to or in some way reducible to, analyzable in terms of physical states or brain states. I don't think that there's any argument, any reason, very compelling reason for believing this. I don't find the arguments very compelling for that. But then I don't find the arguments for the opposite view very compelling either. The view that the mind is irreducible, that it's an extra ingredient to reality, that is just stands in some sort of causal connection to the brain, is a popular dualist view. And I, for what it's worth, don't see a very compelling reason to believe that view either. So far as the philosophical arguments go, for my part, I am inclined towards an agnosticism, I suppose, about or skepticism about how much they show. To give you some idea of a philosophical argument for dualism, and then perhaps Dennett's response to this sort of argument, since you raised the question, and him in particular. One of the more famous arguments for a dualist view is given by Frank Jackson and is known as the Mary argument. It involves a thought experiment, a scenario in which you have a super-duper futuristic scientist who knows everything there is to know about the physics of color vision. She knows just about how the light ray, or the light waves reflect of objects, of what textures, and just the parts of the eye that these the rods and cones, these waves hit, and the signals these rods and cones and other parts of the eye, I don't know the details, send to the rest of the brain, what parts of the brain these light up, what chemicals are sent, and what electricity is sent to what other parts of the brain. She knows all of this in far greater detail than any contemporary scientist. She knows, according to the story, the thought, all the physical facts there are to know about color vision, all the physics, all the chemistry, all the physiology, all the science. She has all the scientific facts, so to speak, under control. It certainly seems like a possible scenario that there's we don't yet, and maybe we will never, have so much knowledge about color vision. But there's one thing I left out about the story, and that is that Mary lives in a black and white world. She has been confined since birth to a black and white laboratory. She's learned everything there is, all the scientific facts there are to know, from a black and white screen, from a black and white textbook. Maybe she's wearing color filtering goggles too, or maybe her skin's painted black and white, or maybe she's somehow colorblind. But this is rectified at some point. She's let out of this laboratory. Maybe the color goggles are removed, or her eyes are repaired, and she sees for the first time, well, she has the sensation for the first time of red, bright red. She sees I don't know, fire hydrant or a rose or something bright red for the first time, and the thought is, what is her reaction? Won't she be astonished? Won't she say, that's what it's like to have the sensation of redness? It seems to many readers, Jackson puts this thought forward, that Mary does learn something new. She discovers something, but she already knew all the scientific facts. So if it's possible to know all the scientific facts, but not to know all the facts, that must mean that there's some facts over and above the physical facts, the scientific facts. There must be some spooky, non-physical, immaterial, if you will, aspect to conscious experience that isn't captured by the science.
New Mysterianism, I think it's called, the idea, right? That
this is a response to the problem of consciousness. What you raised, this question of new materialism. This is
New Mysterianism.
New Mysterialism. Sorry, it's late here. I'm getting tongue-tied. I might turn into the zombie. You thought I wasn't. New Mysterianism is an idea put forward by Colin McGinn, which might engage with this problem and provide a certain answer to, a kind of response to this problem. But the problem itself is one that faces all writers and people who worry about philosophy of mind, and supposed to support this dualist view that there's some aspect of mentality, of psychology, of consciousness that can't be captured by science. There's something to us that isn't entirely physical. We aren't entirely physical things. And to bring Daniel Dennett onto the scene, he has, of course, he is of a materialist inclination and isn't happy to admit that there are such things, such spooky, non-scientific aspects of reality. And he has a particular response to this this thought experiment, if I recall correctly. He digs in his heels and says, no, we shouldn't come to any firm intuitive judgment about what Mary would or wouldn't feel upon being released from the whether she would be surprised at seeing the red rose for the first time. Or we tend, when we think of the example, to put ourselves in the position of Mary, so to speak. We imagine ourselves in this situation just with a little bit more knowledge of physics. And of course, imagining ourselves in Mary's situation, maybe we know a little bit more about physics than we do now. We think we would be surprised to see the red rose, but we're really not imagining the situation carefully enough. Mary, to know all the physical facts, would have to know much more than we know, more than any contemporary physicist does know it all. Maybe your brain would have to be extra big to house all those facts, even just the physical facts about color vision. We shouldn't have any judgment. We're not entitled to any intuitive verdict as to what Mary would feel in such a case, whether she would feel surprise and learn something new. Perhaps, for all we know, she would look at this rose unsurprised. Of course, that's what red looks like. I knew that all along, because I know all the physical facts. I think that is Daniel Dennett's response to the Mary argument. Since you mentioned him, I think it's also the kind of response given by the Churchlands. I hope it makes some sense.
Yeah, the Mary argument seemed like a version of the brain in the pan argument. It seems sort of like a corollary, right? that you could have a brain in the pan that's hooked up to all kinds of things that would give it sensory data, and the brain might not recognize that it's not a thing that can move about, that it's just sitting there in or floating there in a liquid that sustains it. It could have the
Oh,
illusion.
I see. Well, talking about consciousness and brain states and uh, gets us entangled in lots of philosophical problems, though we might distinguish between these problems. There's another question, an epistemological puzzle, a puzzle to do with the extent of our knowledge of the world, a skeptical puzzle about how we know
Yeah.
we aren't in fact brains in vats.
Yeah.
As you suggested, it seems that we could be having all the experiences we do have, even while experiences that are just like intrinsically have just the feel of the experiences we do have, even while we're merely brains floating in vats, being fed just the right chemicals and electrical impulses or what have you to just the right parts of the brain to generate this experience. Of course, if you play with somebody's brain, if you put some sort of, what is it, an electrode, or you poke around somebody's brain, they'll report certain experiences. Maybe if you poke a region of the brain, someone will say, I see red, or I smell the smell of a banana, where I'm from.
Yeah.
And maybe this could be done ingeniously enough to generate an entire experience that is like ours from the inside. How can we tell, in fact, then, that we aren't, that the experiences we're having aren't the experiences of a brain in a vat? Maybe the world, the external world, isn't as we take it to be. Maybe, in fact, there isn't a table here, there isn't a computer screen before me.
Right.
Maybe there's just me, my brain, the vat, and the mad scientist feeding it these strange thoughts and experiences. From the inside, things would look identical. So how can I tell then that there is this real world as I take it to be? That is a skeptical puzzle.
Yeah. Which also
This
gets
is
back
somewhat different from the puzzle about the Mary argument, the puzzle about dualism, though they both involve weird scenarios and thoughts about brains and brain states.
which gets back to things about like artificial intelligence and people. I'm going to be doing a show months down the line about Ray Kurzweil. He's someone who believes that human minds can be uploaded into into a computer system that once it gets sufficiently artificially intelligenced, I guess. But let me end this segment before we get to our next one. Let me get back to, you had mentioned that you study the idea of free will, and I don't know how. I would assume you're familiar with enough actual physics, not metaphysics, but physics, to know the idea of the block universe, that there's not only the three physical dimensions, but the fourth dimension of time, in which everything from the Big Bang or whatever started the universe, if there was a start, till the possible end of the universe, is already laid out, and we are just conscious things that are experiencing it. Meaning, which reduces it to when I was a kid, I remember reading in a book the idea of life or the individual as a roller coaster ride and not the rider, meaning that Tyron Goldschmidt, the ups and downs that you go on a roller coaster are your life, but you are the actual ride, the roller coaster, not the rider, so that any conscious entity could be experiencing the Tyron Goldschmidt experience and think that they're Tyron Goldschmidt. That you would have, in other words, that you would have some kind of supernatural, super beings that could be outside of time, that sort of like the movie It's a Wonderful Life are out there and say, well, that's an interesting life. I'd like to live the Tyron Goldschmidt experience. And you could then, for, let's say, if you lived 85, 90 years, could experience that ride. And, if you were in 1978, when you skinned your knee as a boy playing with your friends, that individual, that sentience, would think it's Tyron skinning his knee at that time. And when you graduated from college and got your degree, you would have those same experiences. So my question to end this is, do you think that, do you believe that there is free will? And if there is no free will, putting aside the idea of God, what that means to God, does having free will or not free will, does that presuppose then that there is predestination? Does free will or lack of free will mean that there is a determinate, things are predetermined, therefore that the idea of a block universe is true?
I should say a few things, and I might disappoint.
Okay.
I don't know so much about physics, and I don't know so much about metaphysics, despite my pretensions to be a metaphysician. There's just so much to know.
Yeah.
I have views on these questions about free will, but I'm not sure of the bearing on of these questions on the nature of space and time.
Okay.
At least the sort of topic of the block universe and that you raise. I guess I'd have to see it spelled out how these are related carefully and have some time to think about it. And even then, I'm likely not to turn up a confident answer for you. As for my own view about free will, yes, I'm inclined to believe that I have free will, and by that I mean that I am able to do sometimes other than what I do. And I'm inclined to believe that means that I am not determined, that the world isn't a deterministic place, that the state of the universe in the past and the natural laws don't necessitate that the universe be a particular way in the future. I'm inclined to believe all this, but whether I can back that up with very persuasive philosophical arguments is a different question. I have seen some philosophical arguments for the view that we have free will, that we're able to do sometimes other than what we do, and thus that determinism is false, that this is at odds with determinism. Another controversial claim, because some people think that we can have free will and be perfectly determined at the same time. Indeed, I think that a majority of philosophers these days think this. If numbers are anything to go by, though I doubt they should be when it comes to philosophical disputes, the fashions often change. I think that we have this free will, as I say, and I think it's at odds with determinism, and so that we're not determined. As for the arguments for it, I've seen some good ones for it, and I've seen some good ones against it too. I've seen some good arguments for determinism, or for the view that free will is compatible with determinism, so we can have both. Cake and eat it. We can be both free and determined. I think that we're probably free. Free will is not compatible with being determined, and so we're not determined. And there are those who will say that we are that we are free and determined, that they're perfectly compatible, and there are those who will say that they're not compatible, but alas, we are determined and so not free. So there really is there are a lot of views on offer, and there are many able philosophers defending each of these views. And for my part, I don't know that I can convince you or the listener that any philosophical argument for one of these views is compelling. I don't know if I hold my views so rationally here on the basis of philosophical arguments. But as to your last question, if I recall correctly, there were a few. Does our you might help me remember it. Does our having free will, if we don't have free will, was your question? Yes, if your question was, if we don't have free will, does that mean that everything is determined? No, I don't think so.
Yeah.
And I don't think that most writers on free will think so either. Certainly, there are many who think that if we're determined, we don't have free will. And that there are many who think further that we are determined, and so that we don't have free will. But that said, I don't think there are many who will say that if we aren't free, determinism is true, because it seems perfectly possible for determinism not to be true. That is, by determinism I mean, and I smoothed over this in what I said earlier, by determinism I mean the idea that a state of the universe at an earlier time necessitates state of the universe at a later time, that there's just one possible, physically possible future of the universe. I don't think that most philosophers think that if we aren't free, then this determinism is true, because it's perfectly possible for us not to be free and for indeterminism to be true. Indeed, some philosophers think that indeterminism isn't a way to get freedom at all. If the universe isn't perfectly determined, well, then we have, so they say, just randomness sometimes on the scene, and randomness doesn't secure more control over our actions. You might picture it this way. On the one hand, if determinism is true, the past necessitates the future. Physical state of the universe, given the physical state of the universe at one time, there's only one physically possible state at a later time. Maybe you could picture us sort of as automatons, just obeying the laws of nature and initial conditions on this picture. Maybe you think that that's at odds with our having free will. But you might think the alternative picture is also puzzling for our thing. The alternative is it's being random in some way, Instead of it being an automaton, I sort of flap around randomly. And that doesn't secure, that sort of randomness doesn't secure control, freedom either. This is what some writers think, that we're caught in a bind. If determinism is true, we don't have free will. And if indeterminism is true, things are random. To some extent, we don't have free will either. So either way you go, we don't have free will. Now, that's not my view, but it is the view that some have. And it would seem, on that last view, to be a view that combines the idea of indeterminism with our not having free will.
Okay.
So that would be at odds with your idea that if we don't have free will, we are necessarily determined. I don't think that's the case. I'm sorry to rattle on
that's fine.
So quickly about these. Maybe I could have explained these particular topics more carefully, but maybe your readers will have some idea. Your listeners will have some idea from that. I hope so. I don't know if I've done a good enough job.
Let's end this segment on that note. I brought up the block universe because to me it's sort of the scientific version of an all-knowing God, which I've often found that people sometimes, scientists and religious people, they mean to say something, but they don't necessarily know to use the right words. Because to me, when you say an all-knowing God has to be 100%. There isn't 101%. So if you have an all-knowing God will know everything that you would possibly do, even if you don't. And same thing with the block universe. The idea of a block universe means that everything that has ever been or ever will be is there. We just aren't experiencing at the moment. So, but anyway, let's end this segment, and when we get back in our next segment, I want to pick up on the idea of definitions and switch gears a little bit, and we will do that in a moment.
I have some fun thoughts for your listeners, if you'd like, on this idea of God's omniscience being all-knowing and how it might connect with puzzles of consciousness. If you want, we can move on.
No, we'll pick up. We'll start with that, and then we'll get to my next point in the next segment.
Sure.
So we'll do that in a moment. Back with Tyron Goldschmidt, and before we get to some of the things I wanted to touch on in the second segment, Tyron ended the last segment wanting to pick up on a point I raised about an omniscient or an all-knowing creator or God or deity or whatever you want to call it. So Tyron, give us your best shot.
Well, you raised the question about the scope of omniscience, and I thought there are some puzzles that your listeners might enjoy and that you might find intriguing in this connection, particularly as they relate to the problems of consciousness that we addressed. So you're right, some people do think that omniscience must involve God's knowing, omniscience being feature or property of God, of knowing everything there is to know, and some take this quite strictly, as God has to know every truth there is. But not all writers on the divine attributes and the nature of God think that God need know everything there is. Encompass all truths, especially if there are some truths that can in principle not be known, or not be known by God. There are similar paradoxes about other divine attributes. Omnipotence, for example, God's being all-powerful. Some people understand this quite strictly as God's being able to do anything that it's possible to do. And we get entangled in puzzles. Can God create a stone that is too heavy for him to move? The puzzle is, on the one hand, if you say he's omnipotent, he must be able to create the stone. But then there's something he can't do, move it. And on the other hand, if you say that he can't create the stone to begin with, well then, to begin with, there's something he can't do. This is puzzling. Can God sin or do something wrong? On the one hand, you want to say that being omnipotent, God should be able to do something wrong. After all, I can do something wrong. But then being essentially all good, we might wonder, should God be able to do, should we include that into the scope of God's power? That he be able to do something wrong? Is this maybe at odds with his perfect essential goodness? And in light of such problems, some philosophers want to limit God's power, or give a precise definition of omnipotence that doesn't encompass these possible actions. And similarly for omniscience, for God's being all-knowing, some writers will conclude in the light of these puzzles that we shouldn't take God's knowledge to include things that it is impossible in principle perhaps to know, or impossible for a being like God to know. Maybe you think that foreknowledge is at odds with our having free will. Maybe you think that. Not everybody thinks that. There are many who think that it's perfectly possible for God to foreknow our free actions. But you might think that a foreknown action is foretold, so to speak, cannot be free. And since you think that we are free, God then shouldn't have to know. You don't want to include under the scope of omniscience God's knowing our future free actions. And in connection with the problem of consciousness which we raised, it seems that there might be some psychological states. There might be some things that we know, some concepts we comprehend, that even God couldn't know and comprehend. There is a kind of knowledge philosophers call knowledge de se, sort of self-ascriptive knowledge. For example, you might be shopping and notice a line of salt or sugar down the aisle and wonder, who's spilling this sugar? And you follow this line for a few hours until it dawns upon you that, there's a hole in your sugar in the car. Spilling the sugar. And you feel embarrassed about this. Now, this is a different thought from Dan has spilled the sugar. Yeah. Note, it's possible for somebody, a second person, to know that Dan has spilled the sugar without knowing that I, referring to himself, has spilled the sugar, because he hasn't spilled the sugar. And it's possible for you to know that I have spilled the sugar without knowing that Dan has spilled the sugar. You might be suffering from amnesia at the time. Okay, so you can know what you know when you say, I am spilling the sugar, without knowing what you know when you say Dan is spilling the sugar. It seems that there are two different objects of knowledge here. Now, some people think that even God can't know what you know when you do know that I, referring to yourself, am spilling the sugar. Okay. God, after all, is not you. He would have to be identical to you to know this. So there might be one kind of proposition that God cannot know. And for another interesting example, you might think that certain concepts like fear, surprise, and doubt can't be fully comprehended by God. After all, a being that knows everything, that is omniscient to any extent, will not be so surprised by what happens next. Okay, they'll already expect it. They know everything. But maybe in order to fully grasp the concept of surprise, you need to have an experience of surprise, to know what it's like. maybe God then can't fully grasp surprise. He can't fully grasp what we grasp when we talk about surprise. He can't fully grasp what we know when we know things about surprise. And you might think, for another example, that an omnipotent, all-powerful being can't properly fear anything. You need to have some sort of vulnerability or weakness to fear something. So an omnipotent being, at least one who knows he's omnipotent, wouldn't be able to fear anything. Maybe God, being omnipotent, doesn't fully grasp the concept of fear. If you think that we have to experience fear to fully grasp it. These are all controversial thoughts, but you might see how somebody could say that God, as maximally knowing as he is, as much as God should know, we shouldn't expect him to know these things. Of course, it's no shortcoming on God's part if it is impossible in principle for him to know these things. But there is a puzzle, another puzzle for omniscience, perhaps. If you or your listeners are interested in exploring this further, there's a nice book by Isawa, a British a philosopher now in Birmingham, who works on these and related puzzles. He has a book on God and phenomenal consciousness, which is very intriguing and tries to see how much of the traditional notion of omniscience, God's being all knowledge, we can salvage. God's having all of the knowledge, God's being all knowing, we can salvage in light of these puzzles.
Well, I think that's a whole show unto itself. My only, as someone who's a writer, my only brief way to state that an objection to someone who's very religious who would argue something like that, or the things that you stated, is that I would just say the God that's being proposed, or the creator that's being proposed, would have to then be called quasi. I mean. Because omniscient is a superlative. I mean, in finances there can be 101%, but if we're talking about the sum of all things, we use 100%, meaning 100%. But let me just
maybe there are some things that God can't know, but he can still know a lot.
Yeah,
enough for traditional religious belief to go through.
Yeah, let me move on and state this. It is June 24th. 2015 Anno Domini as we record this, and Dan Schneider is interviewing Tyron Goldschmidt via Skype. Now, that, I would say, is a reality as far as you and I and anyone else out there could be able to determine scientifically. When I state that on June 24th, 2015 Anno Domini, Dan Schneider is interviewing Tyron Goldschmidt, that is either true or false. An hour and a half ago, that would have been false because this would have been incoming. An hour and a half from now, it will be false because we will be done. And I state this because I am an artist, and many people in the arts have a saying where they say, art is truth. And I always say, art is not about truth. Art, even at its root cause, is about deception. Art is about reality, and artists are translators of reality for others. And so that brings to me into mind the question of truth versus reality. And do you accept that truth and reality are separate things?
I'm afraid that when philosophers start speaking about something as big as reality, I get dizzy. Certainly when they speak about such things as truth, I find myself often confused. This is probably due in part to my not have paid very good attention during a course I took. I audited in grad school on the question of truth. What is this thing called truth? Where is it to be found? Okay, is it how is it to be defined? I wasn't paying very good attention, and most of that went over my head. So I found myself very confused and puzzled when some philosophers speak about truth, and even more puzzled when people who aren't philosophers speak about this question of truth. I think I have some idea of what it is for a sentence to be true. It's true you were just holding a cat. It's not true that you were just holding a dog.
As my
I
cat
hope I'm
Kiwi,
good
she was
enough at
crying to come
identifying
in.
these things. But as for a worked out theory of truth, I'm afraid that I don't have one.
Mm.
And I'm not on top of some of this literature. I
Okay.
just wasn't paying attention, and look how that paid off now. But I would recommend. I think I could recommend for your listeners what must be a good book um, on truth from Simon Blackburn with that title. I think the title is Truth or On Truth. Doubtless that will be enlightening for them. Um, but they'll be one step ahead of me if they've had read it.
Okay.
He's a good philosopher, good at explaining things for a popular audience, and especially better on this topic. If you have more particular questions about
Yeah.
what is true, and what philosophers take to be the truth or disagree about on the truth, I might be able to enlighten you more on that. But as to what is
Yeah.
truth, what kind of animal is it? What is its glow, and what does it mean when it attaches to things? True. I'm probably more in the dark than most of your listeners who have devoted any thought to this
Yeah.
are.
It was my cat Kiwi. She was crying to come into the room. She was lonely, so I had to pick her up. So let's talk about the limits of knowledge for a moment or two. I mentioned earlier, I believe, the old notion of the Earth being the back of a turtle, and the turtle stands on a turtle, who stands on another turtle, who stands on another turtle, all the way down. And I know in science there are ideas of what is knowable. Are there things that are not knowable? Is there something that's a just because answer? Why is the universe this way? Why is there a universe and nothing? When we talk about existence, why is there something rather than nothing? Well, just because might be the only possible answer, because what answer could there be? Because if we said, for example, why is there a universe? Well, it's some super hyper being outside of a universe that's running a science project. Or like some people believe that the universe is a holographic, computer simulation. Well, okay, that's fine. But then if that person or that being there, what made them? So you're just pushing back the question.
Yes.
And
Well,
even if we're infinity minus one from reality, there has to be some underlying reality girding things.
yes. As for the question about turtles, it does strike me now that this is unlikely. I'd imagine, though again, my scientific knowledge isn't very detailed. I'd imagine that the pressures and masses in such a large turtle, I mean, an Earth-sized turtle would just be impossible. I can't see how the center of the turtle wouldn't be liquefied or turned into solid. I don't know how you could sustain a turtle in space for any amount of time a turtle in there, that size, just strikes me as impossible. But as for the philosophical questions about why there is something rather than nothing, this is certainly something I'm more qualified to answer on. I have edited a volume on the puzzle of existence, subtitled "Why There Is Something Rather Than Nothing," in case your listeners are interested in contributing to my small royalties. This is a recent volume, and there is quite a recent upsurge as an interest in this question. Some other volumes have been published, I think, more popular, but so far as I could tell, a very good book by a journalist by the name of Holt on this topic, and John Leslie, somebody who has contributed to my volume, has himself a volume with the title "The Mystery of Existence," as opposed to mine, "The Puzzle of Existence," that overlaps somewhat. There's quite a lot of recent literature on this topic, some of which I've contributed to, and it was the topic of my PhD dissertation. So I can say a little more about what the question is often taken to mean, and the kinds of answers that have been given to it, both traditionally and now. The question's often taken to mean, question's often taken to be a question about concrete things. When we ask why there's something rather than nothing, most of us are thinking about things like you or me, planets or protons, things that exist in space, time, that have some sort of causal power or oomph. We're a little less perhaps interested in why there are abstract things like sets or numbers. But a lot of philosophical literature focuses on this question of why there are concrete beings. Some of the literature focuses on the question of why there are contingent beings. Contingent beings are beings that that exist but could have failed to exist. You, for example, me, are contingent beings. We do exist, but we could easily have failed to exist if our parents hadn't met when they did, if some historical accident didn't occur when it did, we wouldn't exist. And most of the things around us strike us as things like that too. Planets and protons and flowers seem to be things that could have failed to exist. On the other hand, a necessary being would be a being that has a stronger grip on reality, a being that couldn't have failed to exist, a being that would have to have existed no matter what. Many people think that God would have to be such a being. And so sometimes this question of why there's something rather than nothing is spelled out as a question about concrete beings, why there are spatiotemporal, causal things, and sometimes in terms of contingent beings, why there are beings that could have failed to exist. Okay. And some of the answers, as you've suggested, historically have been in terms of the existence of God. Maybe we can explain why there are beings that exist in space and time in terms of a being that exists outside of space and time. After all, to explain why there are beings in space and time just in terms of another being in space and time would just seem to push the question back. So some people think that only a being outside of space and time can answer the question, and God best fits the bill. Similarly, when it comes to the question of why there are the contingent beings there are, why there are any contingent beings, it would seem if we try to answer this question in terms of yet another contingent being, we've just pushed the question back, so to speak. If I explain why contingent being A exists in terms of contingent being B, if I explain why this being that needn't have existed exists in terms of another being that itself needn't have existed, I might have just pushed the question back. Why do any of these beings that needn't have existed existed? Why do they in fact exist? And some people think that the only way to explain why there are any contingent beings would be in terms of a being that isn't contingent. That is a necessary being that has a stronger grip, as I say, on reality. And again, they think that God fits the bill. God, as traditionally conceived, is such a being. So some people do think that the answer to these questions, the questions of why there are concrete beings or contingent beings, are properly answered in terms of the existence of a spaceless, timeless, and necessary being, that is, in terms of the existence of God.
Let me just get it back to my initial question, though, about the limits of knowledge too, because I've found that human beings generally, and this is in day-to-day, day of walk of life kind of things, or when people sit down and they have deep discussions with their life partner, or with a philosopher, or a theologian or something, they have trouble with big things. I'm thinking of things like the idea of deep time. For example, a few hundred years ago, Bishop Ussher and Christian theology had the idea that the Earth began only like 6,000 years ago, and then we discovered geology, James Hutton and Charles Lyell, and we found out, well, the Earth is really millions, if not billions, of years old. And people have people, for example, often mix up the idea that cavemen lived side by side with dinosaurs. Another thing that I think people have trouble with is the idea of nothingness. I mean, what is nothingness? If I try to think of nothing, well, most people think of does blackness, but blackness isn't nothing because there's black. I mean, we can say, that's blackness. So obviously it's not nothing, it's blackness. Do you think that, say, currently as human beings are constituted, which I would think would be obvious, that we do indeed have limits of what we as human beings can know? Do you think, though, can you conceive of, say, a time when there will be, or could there be a consciousness that there are no limits, that they can, that there is nothing that cannot be known? You know what I'm saying? Do you think that human beings can evolve to a state, or that there could be beings that maybe aren't supernatural beings even, but just maybe artificial intelligence that we devise, that there would not be that problem of the limits of knowledge, that knowledge is illimitable, if assuming that knowledge itself is infinite.
Yeah, I don't know. On the one hand, we certainly seem to be pushing the limits of something when we try to answer as big a question as why there's something rather than nothing. Maybe this is too ambitious and not a modest project. But then again, we seem to be good at addressing big questions you'd have never expected us to be able. Who would have predicted the sorts of questions that humans would have been able to answer? Questions about tricky questions about physics, mathematics, questions about things that are very small, subatomic particles, and things that are very big, big bangs and black holes. These things are very different from the sorts of medium-sized dry goods we encounter in our environment, and the sorts of things one would have imagined that evolution developed our minds to deal with. How is it that our minds are so managed to be as successful as they are when it comes to thinking about the very small and the very big? We seem to be pretty good at it. I mean, much better than we would have expected. But maybe at some point we do push the limits. And it's certainly not clear to me in the case of the question of why there's something rather than nothing that anybody knows the answer for sure. There are many different answers and interesting arguments, interesting lines of reasoning for each of these answers. Once they each have some plausibility. Besides the religious sort of answer I gave you, there are other kinds of answers. I don't know if we'll ever be able to definitively say which of these is correct.
Well, let me just ask
don't
you
know.
personally.
There is a wonderful paper about the limits. I forget the title, I'm afraid, offhand, but doubtless your listeners could find it. A wonderful paper about the limits of human knowledge and the prospects of knowing so much, our being able to solve these big problems. A paper written by Michael Anthony from the University of Haifa. I forget offhand the title of this paper, but doubtless something or some version of it must be available from his website online.
Okay.
I'd hope so, and your readers might be interested in reading this paper by Michael Anthony on the possible limits of our knowledge. When it comes to the question of why there's something rather than nothing, I don't know if we'll ever come to the definitive answer, whether we'll ever all be properly said to know what the answer is.
Well, let me ask Tyron.
Wait and see.
Let me ask you, Tyron. Let me ask you your personal, say, gut opinion. Do you think there are limits, and do you think that there's even a possibility that there could be nothing? I mean, I forget anyone else's ideas, just your gut from everything you've experienced. Or
this question of whether the possibility of nothing is a different question entirely. What is nothing? Many recent scientific writers have promised to explain why there is something rather than nothing by explaining how our universe arose from a very thin state of affairs, some sort of quantum vacuum that generated the Big Bang and our universe eventually, as we know it, unfolded. But this, interesting as it is, might not address the question of why there's something rather than absolutely nothing, because after all, it seems like this thin primordial state of affairs, the quantum vacuum and its fluctuations, are quite something, an unusual and exotic something, maybe something very small and very light, but something nonetheless. It seems like we might be able to understand what is meant by nothing in terms of understanding the question about why there's something rather than nothing in terms of concrete entities. I mean, if you take the question to be about concrete entities, there the scenario of there being nothing would involve there being no concrete entities. Okay. No things existing in space and time, no things with causal power. Maybe the only things that would exist in such a scenario, if there would exist anything at all, would be abstract things like numbers, sets, and other sort of mathematical objects that don't exist in space and time, have robust causal powers. Of course, we can't picture this. Picturing a blank and calling it nothing, picturing a black empty space and calling it nothing, might be mislabeling what we're picturing in the sort of way that some scientists, it seems, some contemporary writers mislabel perhaps this quantum vacuum or state of affairs before the maybe we shouldn't be too hard on them, because when some religious writers too explain why there is something rather than nothing, they appeal to God, but then God would seem to be something itself, and maybe something that cries out for explanation. Why does this God exist? You're telling me why this universe of concrete things exists, but God might be just as puzzling in himself. Why does such a being exist? It seems like the scientists and the theologians need to say a little more to give us an answer to this question, rather than just to push the question back onto the quantum vacuum or onto God or onto whatever original being they postulate. Perhaps if we say that initial scientific state of affairs, or that initial spiritual state of affairs of there being God, perhaps if we say that this involves a necessary being, a being that couldn't have failed to exist, we would have made some headway. Because about such a being, we have an easy answer of why it exists. Well, it exists because it has to. It couldn't have failed to exist, quite unlike the things in our universe and our universe itself. There are problems with these answers, but it's not necessarily the case that there aren't replies to these problems. Sorry, we get a little carried away, jumping from one question, the question of nothingness, to the question of the scientific prospects of ultimate explanation and the religious prospects altogether, but they do blend into each other.
Let me end this segment with getting back to a metaphysical question, and then we'll end this segment and we'll do the final segment of the interview. Regarding like nothingness and whatnot, there's the idea of meaning. So often you hear people who hit these existential crises. I want to do something. I want to affect something. My life has to have meaning or whatnot. I personally believe that man creates meaning, or a sentient being would create any meaning in his or her life or in the cosmos. I don't think there's any imminent meaning. If you ask, why does the universe exist? Well, why not? I mean, I don't think that there's. It seems to me silly that well, God created the universe to test this, that, or the other thing. Like the famous biblical story of Isaac, I think, is asked to sacrifice his son to show his love to God. Any kind of meaning like that to me seems silly. Well, the universe exists so that humankind can see how it's gonna evolve over the centuries or something. Do you think that meaning is even possible? And do you think if there is any kind of meaning is something that comes out of a mind or a consciousness? It's not imminent.
Like most of the questions you're asking me, I don't know. I don't know in this case what to begin with is meant by meaning. What is the meaning of meaning? What do we mean when we ask for meaning? Ask about meaning. I'm writing right now a paper for a symposium on a wonderful book by Thaddeus Metz, a South African, a philosopher at least, who lives in South Africa now. The title of the book is Meaning in Life, and it seems to be the most sustained and excellent exploration of these questions. What do we mean when we speak about the meaning in life? What gives us meaning in life? There are theories about meaning, as you say, on which we create the meaning, whatever that comes down to. There are theories about meaning on which God creates the meaning, whatever that comes down to. And he seems to give a wonderful and precise exploration of the ins and outs, the pros and cons of each of these answers. I'm still stuck on the question. I'm after having read now most of the book, I'm still puzzling over what this animal called meaning is that people are searching on after. When people ask me, and when I read the earlier parts of his book, about meaning, what people mean by meaning, and his various thought experiments to test what we mean by meaning, I just kept on coming up with a blank. I don't know what to say about these definitions and proposals he was giving. Are they intuitive enough or not? Are they plausible or not? I might have some sort of cognitive block to questions about meaningfulness myself. So I guess the first thing I ask when you suggest, is there meaning? And where does it come from? Is what is meant by meaning? This is a very, for me, vague term. I don't understand it when people use it. Apparently brilliant people like Thaddeus Metz, I have a hard time grasping despite their best efforts. I don't know if I'm going to again disappoint you on this. I have no special insight to this, but I think that people who do have this question would do well to ask themselves what they mean by meaning to begin with. What is it that you understand by this term? Maybe there are a few things you understand by this term meaning. What exactly do you have in mind? And then to proceed to figure out whether you have that or not. And maybe Thaddeus Metz's book, Meaning in Life, is a good starting point.
Okay. Well, let's end this segment on that note, and we'll come back and we'll do the final segment and talk on a few topics, and then wrap up the interview. And we'll do that in a moment. All right. I want to end this interview with this segment, and it's been a productive interview. Let me ask a question. Let me posit something. I was thinking a few weeks ago after I had interviewed Bishop Spong, and in the intervening time before the interview with you, I had this idea that time and the human awareness of time, is an important thing in the human development, and that it allowed human beings to be empathetic, and that empathy gave rise to questions, and that when we had an idea that time existed, if we saw, say, a person on the roadside injured, we could say, well, maybe if I help that person, they'll get better, and in the future, if I get injured, that person may reciprocate. Whereas if you're a cheetah or a lion or a wolf or even a non-predator, if you're an owl isn't necessarily going to try to help, and hopes that in the recognition that in the future that owl, the first owl, might be injured. And with this idea of empathy and this recognition of time, I think that has allowed the human mind to be able to develop and be able to ask these questions. Just stepping back, do you think that since all of these things involve us cogitating on something, what are your thoughts, say, on what helped to develop the human mind? Do you think it was something such as the awareness of time?
This is how the human mind developed is at least as much a question for psychologists, cognitive psychologists, and people working in harder sciences than it is for a philosopher. I know there are various explanations of how the mind developed, scientific explanations in terms of evolutionary theory. I don't know the details, and I don't know if anybody has the details now. There are religious views about how the mind came to be, in terms of it being created by God. And this isn't necessarily to deny the evolutionary story so far as it goes. Some people think that evolution is a perfectly good explanation. Some religious people think it's a good explanation of the development of our bodies, but our minds somehow exceed or different in some ways from our bodies, and need a divine touch, especially given what we spoke about before, about the scope and powers of our intellect, which far exceed their application to the medium-sized dry goods that we, are dealing with most of the time in our environment. How are we smart enough to know about the subatomic particles and stars? And it also connects to the question that we spoke about some time ago about the nature of mind. I mean, the brain, you might think, and body are physical things, but what about the mind? Is the mind something physical, or some people think it is? And so, explanation of how the body and brain developed would seems to be a complete and good explanation of the mind in that case. Some people indeed are materialists or physicalists about the mind. They think the mind is a material thing just because of the success and promise of scientific explanations. Look, we've explained so much in terms of science. The existence and nature of the mind we should similarly expect it to be explicable in terms of science and evolutionary theory and such forces that operate on us. If the mind is something different, if the mind is something immaterial, if it isn't fully physical, well, there's a puzzle of how complete the scientific explanation can be. I mean, some people who think that the mind has immaterial aspects of the felt sensation of redness, or more robustly, some people who think that minds are souls that are merely in causal contact with brains. Well, then there are questions that science might not be able to answer. How did the souls get tied up to the brain? How did the sensation, this immaterial thing, get tied up to a material thing? If evolutionary forces just operate on the matter, there might be a gap here and a real puzzle. Some people think that this is good reason for rejecting the idea that there are souls or that there are immaterial aspects to our thought and consciousness. But other philosophers are more inclined to think that we should be modest and just admit that we don't understand everything yet, especially if we have very powerful arguments for the conclusion that we can't be entirely physical things. Maybe you think the Mary argument is a good one, despite Dennett's protestations, say. So I think a lot of this original question that you ask about how our minds developed will in part be something that the sciences, psychology, it will be their job to answer. But maybe a part of the question will depend on our philosophical views. If these arguments for the view that the mind is something somehow over and above the physical body or brain, then there'll be questions that science maybe can't resolve on its own. I don't know if philosophy holds any promise for those answers, or whether theology does either. But at any rate, the scientific story might fall short.
Okay. Let me ask a final question to end this interview, and then I'll give you a little chance to just give a final statement of your own. To get back to just the basic central question of this series of interviews that I'm doing, the nature of existence. There's the old saw about a tree falling in a forest and anyone hear it, and that would I'd like to just, you can give some background information on what I'm going to ask, and also I just want your own personal best guess as well. Do you think that existence is dependent upon life/consciousness, or is existence something out there? For example, a rock exists. Do I have to know it? Do I have to pick up that rock and encounter it before it exists? Or if there is a culture trillions and trillions of light years away on the far side of the universe that we will never be able to see because it's just insuperable distance for human beings to ever travel. Does that civilization exist only until I or we as human beings were somehow able to discover evidence of it? What is the general overall the main current of thought in that, and what is your own personal opinion?
It seems to me that some of those questions are easier to answer than others. I mean, I don't know if anybody would think that the existence of faraway life any more depends upon us and our thinking than the existence of life way back in the past before humans were on the scene. I mean, how could the existence of dinosaurs depend on our thinking? We weren't around then. Similarly, it would be very odd to think that the existence of aliens, if such there be, I don't know, could depend upon our thinking. These things exist very far from us. I know that there are some thinkers who think that somehow our thinking and thought constructs reality, but this strikes me as about as implausible as can be. Things existed before us and things exist far away from us. I don't see how that view could have anything going for it, but then I'm often surprised by people who are smarter than I am who come up with ingenious arguments for such things. The more general question, a more serious question, I should say, that you ask is about whether existence or things that there are depends on consciousness in general, if not our consciousness. Certainly, most religious believers will think that everything there is depends in some way on a mind. That's to say that the universe and everything in it, all physical stuff, depends upon the mind of God. Indeed, there have been some ingenious writers in the past who've insisted that everything there is around us is an idea, so to speak, in our or in God's mind. Okay, so we weren't there to look at the dinosaurs. God was. So even if the dinosaurs' existence doesn't depend on our consciousness or mind, it can still depend on God's mind. That's a natural thought for a religious person to think, that God is somehow sustaining everything in being, and maybe we're all sort of ideas floating in his mind, so to speak. One very famous, one of the great early modern philosophers was the Irish philosopher George Berkeley. And he argued that everything there is around us and in the world is just a mind, or an aspect of a mind, an idea in a mind. Everything you see is, in fact, through and through mental. Now, of course, he doesn't think everything there is depends on our minds or his mind. There are things that exist independently from us, but not independent of God's mind, on his view. And this might strike you as very weird thoughts. How could anybody intelligent believe that everything there is a mind? There's no mind, independent matter. Tables and chairs and clouds are constructed out of minds or ideas in minds. This sounds absurd, certainly at odds with science, our scientific picture of the world. But in fact, Berkeley argued that this was eminently reasonable, and the only view, in fact, that was in line with common sense. And for readers who are interested in that, his writing is quite accessible. I would recommend, as a wonderful starting point to philosophy, George Berkeley's Principles Concerning Human Knowledge. This is a little book, short little book, an inquiry concerning the principles of human knowledge, written in the early 1700s by George Berkeley, which argues it's very hard to put your finger on where he goes wrong, for the conclusion that everything there is somehow a mind, or a modification of a mind, or an idea in the mind. He conceives of the world as thoroughly mental through and through. This is in total inversion of the popular scientific picture, popular philosophical picture these days of the world as fundamentally physical. And we have to find a place in this physical order somehow to fit the mind. Maybe we can reduce the mind to the physical, maybe not, but it's got to sort of fit in some way in the scientific picture of things. He seems to turn things on its head and argues that no, mind is fundamental. There is no mind-independent physical stuff. And this sounds crazy, as I say, but his arguments for it are interesting and have some force. I would challenge your listeners to discover where he might go wrong. I am right now writing a commentary. This should be published in 2016, a nice new book on George Berkeley's Principles, to be followed by a book on another early modern philosopher, this time a skeptic, David Hume, a commentary on his inquiry. Sorry, I called Berkeley's book an inquiry. I should more properly say the title is a treatise on the principles of human knowledge, inquiry. If I'm writing on it, I should know the title, and gosh, I hope I've gotten it right this time. But it shouldn't be too hard for your listeners to find, and it's a delightful and short read for those who can follow it. With my commentary, it'll be a little bit easier. But there is a radical view that does have the universe and everything in it depend ultimately on mind. Of course, this seems odd and rubs against contemporary sentiments the wrong way. And some people think the universe is thoroughly physical. Some find it so hard to understand how minds, how mentality, how consciousness can fit in a physical order that they deny it as some sort of illusion. And the idea that there is this stuff, this colorful stuff of consciousness, they think is some sort of psychological mistake we make when we tend to think about our own thinking and ideas. And then there's the middle view dualism that says that there are two aspects to reality. I don't know if this debate is ever going to be solved anytime soon.
Yeah, I should note that probably that the Berkeley book is probably on Project Gutenberg, because we live in a golden age where public domain books can be had for free, and if you just have a Kindle or a Nook or one of those types of devices, even most cell phones, you can download this stuff for free.
It is available on Project Gutenberg, and there is a nice edition with some modernized English also put together by, if I'm not mistaken, I don't know if it's Bennett or Barnes, but it's a website with the title Early Modern Texts, where your earlymoderntext.com, I think it is, where your listeners can find nice editions of these classical texts that have been put in terms of modern English. Have been rephrased in modern English, so it might be easier on the modern ear.
We do live in a golden age of access to information. I just wish more people would access it. But let me end this interview, Tyron, and just give you a couple, 2, 3, 4 minutes, whatever you need, to just give your own final statement on your ideas, your personal ideas. Let me just ask you in this segment, to just your last thing. Let's go with Tyron Goldschmidt. Your own personal idea on existence, or if you have any, even if it's a wacky idea, just something personal of your own view.
I don't think I have very strong views on any of these questions. I certainly don't think there's any compelling philosophical answer that's been given to these big questions. I don't think there's a compelling scientific answer that can be given either, that has been given either. So I don't think philosophy is particularly has done anything particularly wrong in this respect. But I do find many of the arguments intriguing and well worth studying. It's interesting to discover what answers there are and problems there are with such answers. Maybe one day we will get upon the right answer to all these questions. Not yet. As for my own thinking, I am, as I say, not sure at all what the correct answers to these problems are. How could I be? There are people who are so much smarter than I am, who've thought about them harder than me, and disagree completely with what I find on the face of it plausible. But I do find Berkeley's immaterialist view far more plausible than most people these days do. It was the going view it was a popular view, I should say, at least at some point in time among philosophers, a couple of centuries ago, but barely anybody holds it these days. And so far as I can tell, it's very hard to put your finger on where these crazy arguments of his go wrong. So I wonder, maybe if there's more to this idea of Berkeley's, it's called idealism or immaterialism, that the world is fundamentally mental, than we tend to think these days. And as for that's one question of what the nature of the stuff there is in the world is. Is it fundamentally physical or fundamentally mental, both in some way? There's a question of why there is any such stuff, why there is something rather than nothing. Again, I have no real confidence or knockdown argument for any view, but I myself, the idea that there's a necessary being, a being that has a stronger grip on reality, as I've repeated the phrase, a being that couldn't have failed to exist, seems to me to be a promising idea, promising start of an explanation of why there are any things at all. That's this being couldn't have failed to exist, and this being might have brought about or generated the beings there are now. And I'm not pushing for a particular religious answer. I don't know that it can be shown that this being is all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-good, that this being is God, as some people think that it can. It's, maybe the universe itself is a necessary being. Maybe the physical stuff there is, if there is such stuff, is itself that which cannot fail to exist. I don't know. But I do think whatever the exact nature of the necessary being turns out to be, I think that this answer resonates more with me than some others. But again, I'm by no means sure it's about the nature of this necessary being, or that most people find this plausible. There is no knockdown argument, though there are interesting arguments for all these views. I'll maybe finish with an interesting thought that isn't my own and isn't one I endorse, but your listeners might find it intriguing. Maybe some of them will like it because it's an answer to the question of why there's something rather than nothing that is neither religious in terms of a necessary God, nor scientific in terms of a Big Bang or a quantum vacuum or a necessary primordial scientific state. This answer is that there are so many ways there could have been something. After all, there is the world there is, that's one way there could have been something. There's the world there is plus one extra atom, that's another way there could have been something. There's the world there is plus two extra atoms, that's yet another way there could have been something. There's the world there is minus one duck, that's another way things could have been. And yet, while there are so many ways things could have been, there is perhaps at most one way in which there could have been nothing. After all, it's hard to picture more than one blank state of affairs. They all look pretty much the same.
Yeah.
Insofar as we can picture a blank state of affairs at all, that is. Maybe, since there are, if there are, more ways for there to have been something, then there are ways there could have been nothing. Maybe if there are infinitely many ways there could have been something, and at most one way there could have been nothing, it's infinitely more likely and to be expected that there should be something rather than nothing. Now again, that is an intriguing thought that is neither religious nor scientific, and it's not a thought I endorse. In fact, insofar as the answers to the question of why there's something rather than nothing go, I think that doesn't have much going for it. I think there are deep problems with that kind of answer, with spelling it out and making it clear what we mean when we talk about the relevant possibilities and probabilities in this context. But it is intriguing, and it might give your listeners some final food for thought, especially since I should especially end with it because it is a perfectly philosophical argument, not relying on any theological, scientific presumptions, and not leading, so far as I can tell, to any theological or scientific conclusions. It is more purely philosophical, but make of it what you will.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Tyron, for this interview. And for those people who have enjoyed or been enlightened by any of the things that Tyron has said, below this video, you will find a link to the first interview I did with Bishop John Shelby Spong, who gave a theologian's view. And I will next month have the third installment with a physicist named Adam Frank, and I will link all three interviews so that people can watch them in whatever order and compare the philosopher against the physicist against the theologian, and the theologian against the philosopher, and see what connections there are or what divergences there are. So again, thank you, Tyron.
Thank you. I look forward to listening to the other interviews myself.
All right.